Everyone, this is Dr. Hathcock, and today we're going to look at the Cold War. This is what emerges after World War II, this sort of a war of ideas between the United States and the Soviet Union. It never turned into a hot war because, I don't know, both sides were afraid of an exchange of nuclear weapons. We didn't really want to destroy life on Earth over all this. Had it become a hot war, we probably wouldn't be having this video. You probably wouldn't be listening to me right now. So thank God it did stay a Cold War. But this Cold War really was a war of ideas more than anything else. Like trying to prove that one country was better than the other. I don't know, like our economy is better than yours, or our scientific advancements are better than yours. So the Cold War was really more about, I don't know, perception, propaganda, things like that. When historians look back at the Cold War, they tend to state that it was just a series of misunderstandings and disagreements that ultimately triggered the Cold War. You'll recall we talked about the Yalta Conference held there towards the end of World War II. Talked about how Joseph Stalin, the guy you see pictured here on the bottom left, he basically said he was holding on to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. That's really the beginnings of the Cold War, is the Russians holding on to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. And those disagreements, misunderstandings, that mistrust really starts there at Yalta between the United States and the Soviet Union. Everything you see in pink on this map belongs to the Soviet Union. I probably would have picked a more menacing color than pink, but okay, it's whoever the map maker is. That's their call. Everything you see on green is these are nations that are allied to the United States, members of something called NATO that we'll discuss a little bit more in depth here in a sec. And the Iron Curtain is basically the divide between East and West. It's the divide between the green and the pink. Really, the Iron Curtain is the Germanys. West Germany and East Germany are that divide. Everything on the green side of the Iron Curtain, there is democracy, there is capitalism. There is an idea that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness means something. On the other side, the pink side of the Iron Curtain, it's really more about control. It's not about human rights. It's not about liberties. So yeah, there are very different lives being lived, whether you live on one side of that Iron Curtain or the other. You know, when we look back on it all, really what the Russians were trying to do and what Stalin was trying to do was provide sort of a zone of safety for Russia in case of a Third World War. Stalin really did believe that there was going to be a Third World War. He said that communism and capitalism could not coexist. He envisioned a future war that he said would start somewhere in Central Europe. It's not hard to think about because, I mean, the First World War started there in Central Europe. The Second World War did as well. So it's not too hard to think that maybe the Third World War would start there as well. So, yeah, he's trying to use Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria as a way of sort of slowing down any would-be attackers coming against the Russians. It's more about safety for Russia than it is anything else. And, you know, maybe you think about it, the United States has had some really great safety zones. The Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean have really protected the United States from a lot of hostility that could have come its way. So, yes, that's exactly what Stalin is trying to do, is provide security for Russia. But it also was naked aggression on their part. And truth be told, when they took those countries over, they were not at all nice in the way they treated them. So, yeah, that's the emergence of the Cold War, was the agreements, or I'm sorry, the betrayal at Yalta, the holding on of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union, and the United States deciding to make a stand against what it saw as a communist nation that was looking to advance its ideas around the world. Okay, now in looking at foreign policy after World War II, it's all about communism. It's all about the Soviet Union. It became very obvious to the United States that the Russians were going to be a problem after World War II. So the U.S. government was looking for an expert, if you will, someone who understood what the Soviet Union was all about. The guy that they turned to is this fellow you see here on the bottom left of our slide, Mr. George Kennan. George Kennan was an expert on the Soviet Union. His father had actually been an expert on Tsarist Russia, like when it was a monarchy and things like that. George Kennan grew up to be someone who studied communist Russia. So Kennan is contacted by the U.S. State Department to sort of give his ideas on, like, what is the United States facing here? What is the Soviet Union? What are its intentions? How do we proceed? And what many think might be the longest telegram ever sent in human history. Kennan was actually in Moscow at the time that he was contacted by the U.S. State Department, doing some research over there. His reply to the State Department was something like 77 pages long. Just this massively long telegram. And imagine having to pay for that. Of course, the U.S. government paid for that. But anyways, Kennan, in this very long message, he lays out some ideas which basically become known as the policy of containment. But here's what Kennan argues in regards to the Soviet Union. So Kennan said that if you look at it from a historic perspective, Russia has always been about conquering and taking over other people. So Russia, just kind of starts out as a smaller thing that eventually extends all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, comes all the way into Europe as well. And yes, historically speaking, the Russians are about advancing, about conquering, about spreading out and taking new lands. Kennan then also says that communism, by its very nature, seeks to expand, take new areas, it seeks revolution and upheaval. So you have a nation of people that are expansionistic. You have a style of government that is expansionistic. So Kennan says you can expect the Soviet Union to try to advance or to expand beyond its current borders. So Kennan said, Europe can't stop that expansion. The British, the French, the Germans, they're all decimated by World War II. Militarily speaking, they don't have what it takes to stand up to the Soviet Union. So like it or not, want it or not, the United States really is the only nation, he argues, that can stop the expansion of communism around the world. The United States really is the only nation that has the type of power that it would take to stop the Soviet Union from expanding. But then Kennan argues, I wouldn't go directly to war with the Soviet Union. They're the Russians, if you will. Like Napoleon had tried it, he had failed. Hitler had tried it, that war had just finished, he had failed. So Kennan argues, I wouldn't directly attack the Soviet Union, but you have to stand up to them somehow, some way. They only respect power. So Kennan argues, rather than attack the Soviet Union, what you can do is stand up to it by not allowing it to expand. That is to say, you can defend countries from communism coming its way. So you don't attack, but you defend. And that is forever known as the policy of containment. The policy of containment was this idea of stopping the spread of communism around the world, of containing it to where it was in that moment, if you will. Kennan did also argue that given time, he said communism would collapse of its own weight. He said, it doesn't really reward like ambition, talent, I guess we could call that greed. This idea of everyone's equal and everyone gets the same pay and all that. He said that'll just totally collapse on its face. And he was proven right. I mean, eventually communism did collapse in the late 80s and the late 1980s, the early 1990s. So Kennan's throwing down a lot of information that the U.S. State Department agrees with, but I think most important of all, President Harry S. Truman agrees with, the guy there in the middle of our collage of photographs. And to Harry S. Truman, George Kennan was speaking gospel. Truman believed that Kennan had the right idea. So the Truman Doctrine of 1947, which you can see here on our outline, the Truman Doctrine is the United States standing up and saying, we will stop the spread of communism around the world. So the Truman Doctrine is the official acceptance of the policy of containment as put forward by Mr. George Kennan. George Kennan, for the rest of his life, would work in the U.S. State Department. He would later go on to be our Secretary of State as well. So Kennan will be a huge player in the U.S. government for decades to come, as will his policy of containment and the Truman Doctrine. And within that Truman Doctrine lays the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the United States really standing up to the Soviet Union in years to come. Well, if the idea here is to stop the spread of communism, this Marshall Plan, moving on to the next point on our slide, was a really great idea in trying to uphold that Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan was put forward by George C. Marshall, the guy you see there on the bottom right of our collage. George Marshall had been America's highest-ranking officer during World War II. He'd been in Washington, D.C., advising President Roosevelt throughout the war. Marshall is Truman's Secretary of State as well at that moment. And George Marshall says if you really want to stop the spread of communism, then what you need to do is stabilize countries that could fall under the control of communism. So the Marshall Plan is this idea of rebuilding Western Europe with American dollars and American support. So under the Marshall Plan, the United States is going to give billions of dollars to nations like England, France, Italy, Spain, Turkey, Greece. You'll recall on the previous slide, all those nations that were in green, those are all nations that are going to get money under the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan was the United States helping to rebuild Western Europe at the end of World War II. We actually offered that Marshall Plan money to areas like Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, like nations that were under the Soviet Union's control. But Stalin rejected all that. He wasn't going to take any of America's money at that point. He wasn't going to allow the Americans to have any sort of say in what was happening in that part of the world. Because in accepting U.S. dollars under the Marshall Plan, we weren't just giving this money away for free. Any nation that accepted money under the Marshall Plan also had to allow the United States to build military bases on its soil. And that's why even in today's world, we have Army and Air Force bases all across Europe, because the Marshall Plan gave those nations money to help rebuild their economies, bring in new factories, new equipment, new technology, new infrastructure. But in exchange, they had to allow us to build military bases on their soil. But you have to say at the end of the day that the Marshall Plan did work, that the policy of containment in Europe did in fact work. And yeah, it allowed those nations to rebuild and stabilize, because communism really does seek instability. It really does seek an area where people are disaffected and angry and looking for change. And hey, here's this great idea of communism where everybody's equal and free, but really you're not when it comes down to it at the end of the day. So yeah, the Marshall Plan did a great job of stabilizing Eastern Europe and keeping it from possibly falling into communist hands. Well, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonates their first atomic bomb. You'll recall the United States detonated its first device at the end of World War II. But, here you are 4 years later, the Soviet Union detonates its first bomb. And it's like there for a little bit, for about a 4-year stretch, America was the only nation that had the atomic bomb. We had this feeling of total security and total peace. But after the Russians detonate their atomic bomb, it starts a war, a race, if you will, an atomic bomb race, a weapons race. If the Russians we found out the Russians had 100 atomic bombs, we had to build 1,000 to counter them. If they found out that we had 1,000, they had to build 2,000, and it just on and on it went. Both countries kept stockpiling weapons, and it just got completely out of control, this arms race, if you will, here during the Cold War. I read an analysis where in the late 1980s, as communism collapsed, we discovered how many weapons the Russians had. By the way, we also found that a lot of their atomic bombs had faulty wiring and never would have launched when they hit the button. Not all of them. They still could have destroyed a lot of life on this earth. but a lot of their weapons would not have even left the launch pad. But anywho, that's besides the point. But collectively, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons that they could have destroyed life on this earth 7 times over. Once, twice, 3 times. We had stockpiled enough nuclear weapons by the late 1980s that the United States and the Soviet Union combined could have wiped out this planet 7 times over. That is absolutely an out-of-control arms race that starts really there in 1949 with the Russians detonating their first atomic bomb. Well, if there had been a third world war, and thank God there wasn't, it would have started in Germany more than likely. Germany really became the epicenter of the Cold War. Germany became vital to the United States. It became vital to the Soviet Union. It really sort of became ground zero of this ideological war between the East and the West. Now, when Joseph Stalin looked at his big Soviet Union empire with all those nations under his control, I'm sure it was quite pleasing for him to look at it and just be impressed with how big it was. But there was one little fly on Stalin's map, and that was half the city of Berlin. If you recall, at the end of World War II at Yalta, it was agreed that Berlin itself was going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Here you can see on this map we have those 4 zones of occupation. We can see there in yellow is the United States. There in red is the Soviet Union. There in green are the British, and there in blue are the French. So Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones of occupation. That was meant to be temporary. Not yet. So Berlin itself, I'm sorry, I'm screwing that up. Germany itself was divided into those 4 zones of occupation that you see there. And then Berlin itself was also divided along the same lines. All of that was supposed to be temporary. All of that was supposed to be just, maybe a year or 2 until Germany was pacified. But there you were, just a couple of years after the end of the war. The United States, the British, and the French were telling the Russians, hey, it's time to unify Germany. It's time to bring it back under German control. But Stalin, who had already held on to Eastern Europe, was refusing to let go of his share of Germany or his share of the city of Berlin. Well, as it happens, Berlin itself is smack dab in the middle of the Soviet zone. So the British, the Americans, and the French sort of control half the city of Berlin itself. Well, Stalin, in an effort to try to get the West out of his section, out of his little empire, I guess, decided that he would blockade the Allied zones of Berlin. What's known as the Berlin blockade is essentially the Russian army surrounding Berlin and refusing to let anything go in or out on the ground to Berlin. We know for a fact that the Russians were serious about this. Today's world, all we could assume at that point was that they were. But we know for a fact that Stalin had already ordered his military guys on the ground that if anything tried to run through the blockade, it was to be shot. So you have the potential here that if like a U.S. convoy, tank, transport truck, something tries to run past the Russian blockade, it could be fired on by the Russians. That could be seen as an act of war. It's definitely an act of hostility. And I know this sounds crazy, but Stalin is willing to risk World War III over half of a city. At that point, in 1947, the Russians don't even have an atomic bomb yet. So it's a really big, bold move by Stalin to possibly trigger World War III over half the city of Berlin. Well, Harry Truman is committed to stopping the spread of communism around the world. Turns out even if it means half of a city like, say, Berlin. But at the same time, he's not willing to risk World War III necessarily for half the city of Berlin. So the United States and Harry S. Truman will counter the Berlin blockade through something known as the Berlin airlift. What we're going to do is we're going to fly into Berlin everything that the city might need to survive. Food, fuel, supplies, you name it, it's going to get flown in. You can see here on the map that we have on the sort of top right-hand side, you have those little, look like airplanes in those little zones heading into Berlin itself. Those were prearranged flight paths that we had agreed to with the Soviet Union. So we knew for a fact that the Russians had said that, yes, we could use those fly zones. And I would not have wanted to have been one of the guys on the first round of flying in to Berlin. But, you know, at first, when we flew those aircraft into Berlin, there was a real chance that they could be shot down, that the Russians would extend the blockade to the sky as well. Those fighter pilots, I mean, you talk about just, hang on to that wheel, don't let go of that console. Like our guys flying the aircraft said that the Russians were following them, like staying real close to them, making sure they didn't stray off course. But the Russians did allow U.S. aircraft to fly into Berlin. They also allowed them to fly back out. So that was kind of an idea of, hey, we can do this. They're not going to shoot at our aircraft. And just thousands upon thousands of flights were made, like almost nonstop around the clock, in and out of Berlin for a solid year, from 1947 through 1948. You can see there on the bottom left, all those airplanes are being loaded up with stuff. Those guys would then take off and fly into Berlin and land. Try to catch, like, I don't know, a quick nap, some lunch, something, while the plane was being unloaded. Then it was immediately fly back, land at an airport somewhere over in Western Germany. Get a little sleep, get a little rest. They'll load your aircraft back up, and eventually you fly back. So it's just like this nonstop, kept going, kept the flights turning in and out of Berlin. Bottom right-hand side, that's actually a propaganda photograph. I found out those kids were all promised candy bars if they'd wave as the airplane flew over. But the point is that at some point, Stalin realized that the West was not going to give up its sections of Berlin, that the airlift would continue, and that the only way to stop it would be to fire on American airplanes. He also understood in that moment that if he fired on American aircraft, it would trigger World War III. So by June of 1948, the Russians had called off the Berlin blockade. They backed down. They removed their army from the Allied sections of the city. And the Berlin airlift was successful. It kept Berlin operating. It kept it alive. And it kept the western sections of Berlin, anyway, from falling into Russian hands. So if this is the first showdown of the Cold War, and it is, the Russians blink first. The United States wins this Berlin blockade airlift episode. But I promise you the Soviets will have their wins as well. A lot of Russia's victories will come in the space race. They'll be like the first nation to put a satellite into outer space. They'll put the first human, a guy named Yuri Gagarin, into outer space. So, yeah, the Russians will have their days. They'll have their victories in the Cold War as well. But what this shows the Soviet Union and Stalin is the Truman Doctrine is for real, at least when it comes to Europe anyway. We're going to do everything we can to stop the spread of communism in Europe anyways. You'll see how it's a different story in Asia here in a minute. The United States, the British, and the French began to realize that the Russians weren't giving up their section of Germany. So eventually the United States, the British, and the French will form a new nation called West Germany, which was a democratic nation with a constitution and a capitalistic economy. Stalin, being so reactionary, after West Germany was formed, he creates East Germany. And people living in East Germany were just awoken one day and told that they were now a part of a new country called East Germany, which was a police state. It really was just a puppet government controlled by the Russians. It was a communist nation. And it wasn't really fun living in East Germany for the remainder of the 20th century. People living in East Germany just understood that the phones were tapped. The minute you picked up the phone to call your mother, somebody was listening to your conversation. Kids who went to school in East Germany, they were told things like, hey, if you hear your parents over dinner use words like liberty, independence, freedom. Be sure to let your teacher know. And they were essentially turning their children against them, like kids were spies in a way, in a sense, on their parents. And yeah, I would say that East Germany just, it really takes the cake on what it is to be oppressed and living in a police state. Maybe you've heard of the novel 1984, Big Brother, the government's in charge of every aspect of your life. East Germany was really about as close as you could get to that Big Brother type government being true. And I've always said this, like, it sucked living in that part of the world in the 20th century. I mean, just think about it. World War One, then you go through horrible depressions, and then Hitler comes to power, right? And then you have the rounding up of the so-called subhumans, Jews, people like that, concentration camps, the Holocaust, then World War II. And at the end of World War II, you're controlled by the communists, by the Soviet Union. Now you have to live through this police state. That was a tough 100 years trying to live in that part of the world in what becomes known as East Germany. Not too long after that, NATO is formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You'll recall the map where all those nations were in green. NATO was Western Europe and the United States forming an alliance to stand up to the Soviet Union and to stop the spread of communism into Europe for sure. Again, not to be outdone, Stalin formed what's called the Warsaw Pact, which was all the nations you'll recall that were in pink. And the Warsaw Pact was basically all those nations allying themselves against NATO. And it basically is like saying, okay, so if the Russians attack West Germany, then they're at war with all the nations in green. It's also a way of saying, hey, if the United States should ever attack East Germany, it's at war with all those nations in pink. So it sounds a lot like the alliance system of World War I. But it really was something that the nations of Western Europe in particular felt like they needed to do. They just had to let the Soviet Union know how serious they were about stopping the spread of communism, at least in Europe. And what we say is the containment policy worked in Europe. NATO, West Germany, the stand for half the city of Berlin showed the Russians how serious the United States was about stopping the spread of communism over there. So containment does work in Europe through military buildup, Marshall Plan, the United States, sending out the money that was necessary to rebuild. So containment worked because of a military buildup, economic backing, and just showing the Soviet Union how serious the U.S. and her allies were about stopping that spread of communism. It's a very different story in Asia, though. Asia, as it turns out, is going to be fraught with disasters and missteps. But in looking at post-World War II Asia, I guess the first thing to say is that Japan did a great job of rebuilding after World War II. The Japanese really didn't have to worry about any other nation occupying it. Only the United States occupied the Japanese islands at the end of World War II. So Germany's kind of in this weird situation where you have the British, the Americans, the French, and the Russians all controlling it. And that was going to make rebuilding in Germany hard. But Japan doesn't have those same set of circumstances. Again, only the United States occupied Japan at the end of World War II. So like the Russians don't really have any say what happens to Japan at the end of the war. Japan would rebuild very quickly to form a democratic society with a capitalistic economy. In today's world, when we look at Asia, Japan is the strongest ally of the United States in that part of the world. China, though, is a very different story. And because we're kind of getting low in our semester and low on time, I'm going to really kind of do this in a little bit of a quicker style than I normally would. But China descends into civil war at the end of World War II. The two fighting factions in China are Chiang Kai-shek, the guy you see on the bottom left-hand side of our slide. He represents democracy, capitalism. He's an ally of the United States. He had actually been elected the leader of China, Chiang had. And he's going up against Mao Zedong. Mao is the guy sort of in the middle, bottom middle of our slide. Mao represents communism. a people's revolution, if you will. So China is warring between capitalists and communists for the fate of the country. Truth be told, that war had started before the Japanese invaded China in 1931. But then once the Japanese began to attack China, the two sides put aside their animosity just to fight for the country at large. But now that the Japanese have surrendered and been defeated, they go back to fighting each other for control. Reader's Digest version of this, Chiang had money, he had the weapons, he had the backing of the United States, but the people really didn't like Chiang. Chiang turned out to be a bit of a brutal dictator. He wasn't really a nice guy. Mao, on the other hand, I don't know, the people admired Mao. They supported him. They liked his ideas of like leveling society and making it equal. I guess you could say that Mao had the will of the people. Chiang had the power. And honestly, the will of the people tends to win out. Sometimes it could take years, it could take decades, but eventually the will of the people will win out. And to make a very long story short, the United States really couldn't do much in China, short of sending in the U.S. military. And that would have been very tough for the U.S. military to come in and fight Chiang's fight for him. You have a guy in Chiang who's not a very popular man. It would not have been good to send American forces in to fight for an unpopular man. And U.S. diplomacy, it was really the only option they had was to try to get these two sides to coexist. There was talk of creating a North China and a South China, where they could sort of like one would have one, one could have the North, the other could have the South. But, we were asking China to coexist, capitalism and communism, while at the same time arguing that we couldn't coexist with the Russians, right? Like that we're making stands in Europe against the spread of communism. So it was a little on the hypocritical side to expect the Chinese to be able to coexist, whereas we're showing that we really can't coexist with the Russians at that point. So rather than belabor the point, in December of 1949, Mao and his communist forces will take China. China does fall to communism in December of 1949. Chiang and the government of China evacuated. They managed to get out and they fled to the small island of Formosa, which they very quickly renamed the nation of Taiwan. And if you've been watching the news at all lately, you know that Taiwan is something that China wants back. China does not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. But the United States has always committed itself to defending the island of Taiwan. So, that's a possible future problem between our two countries going forward. But let me stick to the history aspect of things. So you look here, it says China falls to communism and then the effects in the U.S. The problem from a U.S. perspective is we're supposed to be in a policy of containment. President Truman has told the world that we're going to stop the spread of communism. But China is a really big country that's gone red and fallen into communist hands. So President Truman is hit politically very hard with the fall of China to communism. He's asked some very tough questions like, hey, I see what we're doing in Europe and it seems to work, but it looks to me like we're not serious about stopping the spread of communism in Asia. So President Truman has to tell the country, hey, look, China's my fault. That's on me. But going forward, I pinky swear promise that we are going to stop the spread of communism around the world. So it leads to his reaffirmation of the Truman Doctrine, his reaffirmation of we're going to stop the spread of communism around the world. So that's the big fallout, I guess you could say, is that President Truman has to say we're going to stop the spread of communism around the world. That reaffirmation of the Truman Doctrine really is the reason why we go on to have a war in Korea. Now, this Korean War is a mess. If you look at the right-hand side on that map, there's a lot of arrows going back and forth with different colors. Tragically, I'm going to have to give you the Reader's Digest version of this because, again, we are low on time for the semester. But this Korean War happens more than anything because of what the Russians did at the end of World War II. You'll recall they went on a land grab at the end of World War II, so that there were communist forces in China, which helps Mao in winning his revolution. That also meant that there were communist forces in the northern sections of Korea. So North Korea was formed as a communist nation, and South Korea was formed as a capitalist or democratic nation. The United States was backing South Korea, while the Soviet Union was backing North Korea. Well, in June of 1950, the North Koreans decided that they wanted to unify the country under communist control. So they invade South Korea, as you can see, in June of 1950. The yellow arrows on that map on the right-hand side indicate the North Korean advance there in June of 1950. The United States had to intervene. The reaffirmation of the Truman Doctrine meant that the United States would have to intervene. So Harry S. Truman will send General Douglas MacArthur and the U.S. Army in to try to stop that North Korean advance. You can see on that map on the right, U.S. forces were really pushed back to the tip of the South Korean peninsula. MacArthur, rather than just go in and sort of, resupply U.S. troops, what he pulled was something we call the Incheon landings. It's that little box on the left-hand side of South Korea. You can see a little arrow pointing into Seoul. What General Douglas MacArthur did is he attacked the North Korean army in its rear, cut it off from its homeland, its base, and then just turned and devastated the North Korean army right there as it stood. It was very impressive. It was a big move by MacArthur. It's the type of strategic thinking that's still taught at West Point today. They really do point to the Incheon landings as a way of using your brains, your strategic ideas to win a war. So with the North Korean army decimated in the field, South Korea is essentially liberated. It's free. He saved the day. And you have to argue that at that point, the policy of containment has been upheld. Communism has not spread into South Korea. But the United States got a little, a little greedy. MacArthur was talking with President Truman. The two men are there on the bottom left-hand side. MacArthur's on your far left. Truman's there on the right, President Truman. MacArthur convinced President Truman that we could invade North Korea, that we had knocked out their military. They had nothing left to fight with. The war should have stopped right there with the policy of containment being upheld. But again, the Americans got greedy. So U.S. UN forces attacked into North Korea, which is a set of blue arrows that you see there on the map. They were winning. They were taking over the peninsula. It looked like just a matter of time before U.S. UN forces would win it all. But as U.S. forces got close to the Yalu River, the Yalu River is the border between Korea and China. The closer U.S. UN forces got to the Yalu River, it made the Chinese a little worried. The Chinese were very worried that the United States might send its troops across the Yalu to try to liberate China from communist control. So the Chinese warned the United States to not intervene, to back off, to withdraw its forces. And at that point, Douglas MacArthur started threatening China. He made statements like, we can use nuclear weapons against the Chinese. His literal statement was, we could blow them back into the Stone Age. And he's talking about using nuclear weapons against a major world power. And he doesn't have the right to use those nuclear weapons. That's a presidential call. That's above his pay grade. And Harry S. Truman needed this situation to slow down. He did not want the Chinese to intervene. He definitely didn't want the Russians to come to the aid of communist China. Remember, they've got atomic bombs. So Harry Truman ordered the U.S. Army to halt, to stop its advance, to try to give this situation a chance to sort of relax and breathe. Not only had MacArthur been saying things he shouldn't have said, inciting, making the Chinese angry with talk of blowing them back into the Stone Age, but he also violated direct orders from President Truman. He did not slow down the U.S. military. He kept pushing and attacking into North Korea. So Douglas MacArthur became a problem that President Harry S. Truman had to deal with. And he fired Truman right there in the middle of the Korean War. That was not a popular move back home in the United States. A lot of people were frustrated and angry at Harry S. Truman for making that move. They were already mad at Truman for China falling to communism. Now they're mad at Truman for firing MacArthur, who's like winning in every way, right? Winning this war in Korea. But at the end of the day, MacArthur did violate a direct order from the President of the United States. It was a fireable offense. So yes, MacArthur was removed from command for violating direct orders from the President of the United States. At some point, the Chinese did intervene. Just short of 1 million Chinese soldiers came pouring across the Yalu River. Something like 950,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River. That was a huge army. The United States was not prepared to face that type of fighting. And now let's look at the black arrows as we're turning this back and forth and back and forth. The black arrows represent China getting involved in the war. And now the Chinese were winning. They were pushing U.S. UN forces out. The United States was losing this war at that point. And U.S. UN forces were pushed all the way back into the south. And you can see the Chinese even began to push further on into South Korea itself. But then some big things happened to slow the Chinese advance. First of all, Harry Truman put a guy by the name of General Ridgway in charge of U.S. UN forces. General Ridgway replaced MacArthur. Ridgway convinced the American army to stop retreating, to hold its ground, to fight back. He was a really good commander of men. He had been a general during World War II in Germany. General Ridgway had been. So U.S. UN forces stop retreating. They hold their ground. They start to fight back. But also the U.S. Air Force came in with a new invention called napalm, which is this horribly lethal killing device. It's sort of like this gelatinous, flammable gasoline mix that just it's devastating in combat. So using napalm and the U.S. Army standing its ground and fighting back, the Chinese advance was eventually halted. You can see here in 1953, later down the road, a ceasefire is called for between the United States and Chinese there in the Koreas. And along the 38th parallel, roughly along the 38th parallel, the two nations stabilized so that there is still a North Korea, there is still a South Korea all these many years later. In a strange way, the policy of containment is upheld, just the back and forth, the craziness of this war. And what Korea taught us more than anything is that combat had changed. In the age of nuclear weapons, you can't just go out and defeat your enemy whole. Your enemy could have friends like, I don't know, the Russians. And what Truman was thinking about when he ordered MacArthur to stop the advance, he wasn't like being a coward or anything. He's just thinking, okay, so if the Chinese intervene, that leads to the possibility of the Soviet Union intervening. And if you look at the very, very, very top of your map, you can barely see it there in yellow as the Soviet Union on sort of the extreme right-hand side of North Korea. So if the Chinese intervene, it could lead to the Soviet Union intervening, and that means that the atomic bomb could be used in fighting this fight. If the Russians start using atomic bombs, the United States would have to respond with using atomic bombs. And you have to ask yourself, is life on this earth, is it worth possibly destroying life on this earth because of the Korean Peninsula? And the answer really is no, it's not. So we had to start looking at warfare in new ways. And Korea taught us that we had entered into a new age of thinking and a new age of fighting. And that leads us into the impact of nuclear weapons. For the United States going forward, it's an age of limited wars with limited objectives. You always have to factor in the possibility of a nuclear strike when you go to war. You can't just go in and plant your flag in your enemy's capital anymore. It's not about you build up more than they got, you go in and you wipe them out. At some point, if a nation is losing a war, in their desperation, there's a likelihood that they'll push the button and start launching nuclear weapons at you, which means that you would have to start launching nuclear weapons at them. So rather than risk the possibility of a global nuclear war, we fight limited wars with limited objectives. Really what we try to do going forward is just stop the spread of communism. MAD is probably the greatest acronym in all of human history. It stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Mutually Assured Destruction was this idea that if, and it really is the United States who came up with MAD under President Eisenhower. We'll talk about him in a little bit. When Eisenhower was president and he met with the Soviet Union, he made it very clear to the Russians. He said, look, if you attack something that's a high value target to us, like, I don't know, say West Germany, he said, look, if your tanks start pouring into West Germany and your fighter aircraft are coming into West Germany, I need you to understand I'm not going to respond in kind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to launch nuclear weapons at you if you go against things that I consider to be high-level targets. So the Russians said, you know what? We feel the same way. If you should attack something that matters to us, like, say, East Germany, our response would also be to start launching nuclear weapons at you. So it's mutual. The two countries agree it's mutual, and it absolutely would have assured the destruction of the planet had we gone through with all that. So MAD is what prevented World War III. MAD is what kept this thing a Cold War rather than a hot war, because both the United States and the Soviet Union had to respect that the other side had nuclear weapons, that we had within us the capability of wiping out life on this earth. So mutually assured destruction, as insane as it sounds, is what prevented World War III and a nuclear exchange between our two countries. Then along the way, in the early 1950s, the United States detonates a hydrogen bomb. This is a more lethal device than the atomic bomb had been. We first tested the hydrogen bomb at a set of islands in the Pacific called the Bikini Atoll. If you could, go on YouTube and you can watch the tests of the hydrogen bomb from back in the day. They didn't even know what this thing was capable of. The first bomb was sort of dug into the sand of a beach on the Bikini Atoll. You get the 3, 2, 1, it goes off. And just this intense blast, mushroom cloud, the shock wave as it goes out. They had like old decommissioned battleships out there around the Bikini Atoll just to see, how destructive is this thing, and it's just knocking out those ships. They really did not know what they unleashed when they first detonated a hydrogen bomb. By the way, Bikini Atoll, that's where the swimsuit gets its name. The bikini. The guy who invented the bikini said it was, that it was this bombshell of a swimsuit, that it would knock you out like a hydrogen bomb kind of a thing. So, yeah, there's a silly reason why the bikini is called the bikini. But with the hydrogen bomb, now the arms race goes to another level. Once the United States detonates its first device in 1952, the Russians began to investigate, figure it out, and by 1954, they're detonating their first hydrogen bomb. So now the arms race goes next level with even more lethal killing devices. And a hydrogen bomb, like if one of those goes off, I explained when in World War II, when atomic bombs went off, it was like 100,000 people would die. If a hydrogen bomb goes off, it depends on where it goes off. It's a matter of like how many millions of people could possibly die if a hydrogen bomb is dropped in the right area. It would just absolutely knock out major cities around the world. So fingers crossed and pray, hope that we never use one of those god-awful things in combat. Okay, so in looking at the McCarthy era, I'm really going to go machine gun fire style, rapid fire machine gun style here, because again, we're kind of running low on time in our semester. But the McCarthy era, I guess if I could sum it up, I would call it a witch hunt. It was using the fear of communism, the paranoia of communism, to sort of mete out political aims. But the central figure in all of this McCarthy era is Senator Joseph McCarthy, the guy that you can see there on our collage. Senator Joseph McCarthy had served in World War II. His nickname was Tail Gunner Joe. He'd served aboard a U.S. bomber during the war. He was a tail gunner on one of those bombers. And Senator Joseph McCarthy, in running for a senator seat from the state of Minnesota, he argued that he had a list of known communist spies here in the United States, and that if he were elected to office, he would do everything in his power to out these communist spies and to keep communism from spreading to American shores. There's a lot of fear of the Soviet Union at that point in 1948. There's really a fear of espionage, which, I mean, some Russian spies had been captured to that point. So McCarthy wins his Senate seat, and he goes after his so-called list of communist spies. And in doing so, he goes after a lot of people, like in Hollywood, for example. You can see their Hollywood blacklisting. He went after certain producers and directors in Hollywood, saying that their films were overtly communist, that through the film industry they were trying to present a positive view of communism that would, get Americans to support it. And I don't know, it got a group of producers blacklisted. Like these people were made to testify before Congress. Each of them denied that they had any doings with communism or the Communist Party. But the sad thing is, for those people, they never worked in Hollywood again. To be blacklisted is to basically, people say, well, okay, maybe you're not in jail, but I'm not going to hire you because you're associated with communism and things like that. A lot of those movie producers had to move to Europe to continue to make movies and things like that. So, he's going after Hollywood. Hollywood's always been a cheap, easy target for politicians to go after and attack. So anyways, you have the Hollywood blacklisting. All this fear, paranoia, it ruined a lot of people's lives. Lucille Ball, I don't know if you know who she is. I Love Lucy, the actress who portrayed Lucy in that TV series. Lucille Ball's father, back in the 1930s, had gone to a couple of Communist Party meetings. I mean, like, this is the height of the Depression. People are willing to listen to anything as a way of trying to survive. And I don't know. During the Depression, people listened to the Nazis. They listened to communists. They listened to a lot of different ideas about what could save the country. Anyway, Lucille Ball's father did go to a couple of communist meetings. He asked Lucille to go with him to one of those meetings. She did. She said that she sat there for like 10 minutes and she got up and left because she realized these people were crazy. So, okay, Lucille Ball went to a Communist Party meeting in the 1930s, and she walked out 10 minutes later. But, she was made to answer all types of questions. Are you a communist? Are you affiliated with the Communist Party? Things like that. It led Bob Hope to issue the joke. The only thing read about Lucy was her hair. She's not a communist, for God's sakes. But it's what this witch hunt did. It put people on the stand. It forced them to answer questions. And most of the time, these were innocent people who, like I said, their dad went to a couple of meetings. They went for 10 minutes and left, but they're grilled, they're harassed. Some of these people are labeled as communists for the rest of their lives. Now, the story of Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss, just to be real quick about it here. Whittaker Chambers was a known member of the Communist Party. He had confessed as much. Whittaker Chambers is a case of, like, he thought communism was the answer, but then he came to realize that actually it wasn't, and he renounced communism. He stopped being a member of the Communist Party. So this is an American who was a communist, realized it wasn't the answer, renounces all of that, and just, embraces democracy, capitalism, baseball, apple pie, all things American, right? Well, Whittaker Chambers testified before Congress that he had seen Alger Hiss at a Communist Party meeting back in the day. Now, Alger Hiss was a high-level member of the U.S. State Department at that moment. Alger Hiss had been at Yalta. You'll remember that big meeting at the end of World War II. He had been one of the people advising President Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. And so people began to sort of speculate that Alger Hiss was talking to Roosevelt, telling Roosevelt not to stand up to the Russians, not to stand up for Eastern Europe. That's a lot of speculation on their part. None of this is absolutely proven. It's all just speculation. But if Alger Hiss were proven to be a member of the Communist Party, it would have a huge implication on national security. It would have a huge implication on the State Department itself. Alger Hiss was made to swear or testify before Congress. He denied everything. He denied that he was a member of the Communist Party. He denied that he had any affiliation with communism. And it was never really proven, truth be told, that Alger Hiss was a communist. Now, he was arrested for contempt of Congress. In his testimony, he said something that was proven to be untrue. But that he was a communist was never proven. But Alger Hiss's career was destroyed at that point. He would never work for the U.S. government again after that. What ultimately undid McCarthy in his witch hunt is known as the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy said that there were high-ranking officers in the U.S. military that were also communists. So he goes after the U.S. military with his hearings. He went after lieutenants in the U.S. Army. They were made to testify, as to their loyalty, whether or not they were members of the Communist Party. But the biggest undoing of all for Senator McCarthy was when he went after George Marshall, the architect of the Marshall Plan, the guy who had been our highest-ranking military officer during World War II. McCarthy was starting to talk about going after George Marshall as a communist and saying that Marshall, he believed, had ties to the Communist Party. At that point, President Eisenhower, who's going to be president at that moment — I know I haven't gotten him into the White House yet. Sorry about that. But Eisenhower said, okay, enough's enough. You don't go after sacred cows like George Marshall. You don't go after the guy who helped us defeat Hitler in World War II. And at that point, really, people began to see McCarthy for what he was. He was really a bully. He was just a guy grinding a political axe and trying to get power, trying to get support, things like that. Another thing that sort of unraveled McCarthy was the fact that those Army McCarthy hearings were televised. So Americans could tune in every day to watch the proceedings as they happened. And McCarthy was very belligerent, pounding the desk, pointing fingers, screaming at people. Just came across as a bully, as a sort of a very aggressive guy. And Americans were very turned off by his actions, his mannerisms, the way he was treating witnesses and things like that. At some point, the McCarthy era just starts to go away. Americans really begin to realize this really is a witch hunt, and it is ruining people's lives. And, Joseph McCarthy, he just was not reelected back to that congressional seat. Tragically, he died a few years later of alcoholism. He literally drank himself to death years later on down the road. But one thing that does emerge out of this McCarthy era is the rise of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Richard Nixon was a guy who served in the House of Representatives at that moment from California. He was a member of something called HUAC, HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Nixon really gained this reputation during the McCarthy era as tough on communism, crusader against communism. Nixon sort of began to rise in power, if you will. So much so that Nixon will be put on the ticket as Eisenhower's VP. He'll serve for 8 years as Vice President of the United States. And then later on in 1968, Richard Nixon will win the White House and go on to be President of the United States. So that rise really starts here in the McCarthy era, as Nixon gains that reputation as someone who's tough on communism. He'll also sort of gain this reputation as a guy who's tough on crime, tough on communism, just, I guess, an all-around tough guy is what Nixon will be getting the reputation for. Okay, so to wrap up this topic, we're going to look at Truman's fair deal, sort of get into the politics of the early Cold War. So Truman, in 1948, ran for the presidency for himself. You recall at the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a brain hemorrhage. Truman was the vice president who became president. So he led us through the end of World War II. But in 1948, Truman ran for the presidency in his own way. Truman's fair deal that he ran on in 1948 was really some progressive stuff for that time. Truman talked about ending Jim Crow in 1948, ending the age of segregation and segregation laws. He talked about government housing for low-income families. He talked about government financial aid for students who wanted to attend college. So yeah, this is a guy who's he's also talking about universal health care for all Americans. And here we are half a century later plus, still arguing about universal health care for Americans. So Truman's Fair Deal, kind of playing off the New Deal title, really was progressive stuff for 1948. It was big government. It was going to be expensive, government housing, financial aid, all that sort of stuff. But he does go on to win the presidency in 1948, but barely. His party didn't just split into two. It actually split into three. There was a progressive party that ran for the Democrats in 1948. And then there was a third group called the Dixiecrats, mainly Southern Democrats that ran in 48 as well. Somehow, some way, even though his party was divided into threes, Harry S. Truman pulled off a big miracle in 48 and won the White House. So the Democrats would hold on to the White House there in 1948. But the Congress turns very Republican in 1948. The Republican Party emerges out of the Depression, New Deal, World War II. It's a big moment for the Republican Party as they take the majorities in the House and the Senate in 1948. So that meant that a Republican Congress really wasn't going to give Harry Truman anything that he had called for under the heading of the Fair Deal. Truman's last 4 years in the White House were not fun in many ways, just constantly fighting with that Republican Congress. That Republican Congress refused to give in on any of the measures that he called for in the Fair Deal. Government housing, the possibility, the idea of a welfare, of food stamps, of financial aid, desegregation. They just were not going to cave on any of the things that he had called for in the Fair Deal. Those things would pass in later decades, but it wasn't going to happen there in 1948. So Harry Truman decided not to run for the presidency in 1952. He'd had enough. Thank you very much at that point in time. Just in time for the 1952 campaign, that Republican Congress had passed the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which basically stated that presidents could only serve 2 elected terms in office. So one way to remember this is the number 2 is in there everywhere, right? 2-2, 22nd Amendment means presidents can only serve 2 elected terms as president of the United States. So it sets term limits on presidents too. Harry Truman was actually the last man who could have run as many times as he wanted. He was in a way grandfathered in, but it doesn't matter. He decided not to run in 1952. That's probably a good choice because the Republican nominee for president in 1952 is Dwight Eisenhower, the guy you see there on the right. His nickname was Ike. Somehow they took Eisenhower and they turned it into Ike. But people all across America in 1952 had little buttons on their shirts that said, "I like Ike." It really didn't matter who the Democrats were going to run. Eisenhower was more than likely going to win. This is the guy who defeated Hitler. This is the mastermind of the D-Day invasion. And he was just like your nice, friendly grandfather that everybody loved. And if this guy had stood up to Nazi Germany and defeated Nazi Germany, the feeling was he could stand up to the Soviet Union as well. So Ike was going to win the presidency in 1952. Truthfully, it didn't matter who the Democrats ran that year. All right, well, that's it for this topic. You guys take care. Have a good day. Bye.